In this lesson, we're going to look at how you can use the formula editor to apply CSS classes conditionally and power CSS variables. First, let's take a look at conditional CSS classes. In the CSS module of this course, we briefly touched on using CSS classes in traditional text-based coding to apply styles to elements. In your projects, you may need to set different styles on elements programmatically, for example, when variable values change. Let's take a look at an example. On this page, I have a main element with a button element inside it. I've set up a variable named gradient with an initial value of false. I've also added a click event on the button which toggles the value of gradient, switching it back and forth to true and false, just like how we toggled the light switch variable in a previous lesson. Now, when the value of gradient is true, I want the main element to be styled with a nice gradient background instead of a solid color. And we can do that with a conditional CSS class. Select the main element and view the Attributes tab by pressing A on your keyboard. Find the Classes section and click the plus button. In the input field, type a name for the class. Let's call it Gradient. Click the FX button to open the formula editor. Here, you can choose conditions that result in true or false to determine when that CSS class will be applied. For the gradient class, let's apply it when the value of the gradient variable is true. Select the gradient variable. The gradient class will now be applied when gradient is true and removed when gradient is false. Close the formula editor and navigate back to the Style tab by pressing S on your keyboard. Add a new style variant using the plus button at the top of the Style panel, find the Classes section and click the drop-down. Any classes you configure on the Attributes tab for this element will automatically show in this drop-down. Select Gradient, and now you can add a beautiful gradient background under this style variant using all the skills you learned in the CSS module of this course. Now go into test mode, click the button and see the gradient class toggle on and off, matching the value of the gradient variable. If you exit test mode when the value of the gradient variable is true, you'll also see the applied gradient class in the HTML element tree on the left. Next, let's take a look at how to use the formula editor to calculate CSS variables. In the CSS module, we covered how to create CSS variables to avoid copying and pasting hard-coded values in the style panel across different areas of your projects. When creating CSS variables in the style panel, you'll notice that there's an FX button next to the CSS variable definitions, which means that you can use the formula editor to calculate that value. Let's look at a fun example where we'll combine variables, events, and CSS variables to increase the border radius of this button each time it's clicked. On the data panel, I have a variable named border radius with an initial value of 0. I've set up a click event on the button that uses the formula editor to increment the value of the border radius variable by 2 each time the button is clicked. On the button element, I've created a CSS variable named border radius using the length percentage syntax. Further down in the style panel, in the borders section, I've set the border radius to use the border radius CSS variable. Now, let's use the formula editor to use the value of the border radius variable from the data panel as the value of this CSS variable. Next to the CSS variable, click the FX button to open the formula editor. Select the border radius variable. Next, click the unit drop-down at the top left of the formula editor and select pixels. Close the formula editor. Now, go into test mode by pressing T on your keyboard and click the button repeatedly. You'll notice the border radius update in real time as the border radius variable is being incremented, which is powering the CSS variable. One final thing to cover is being able to use the formula editor to get the theme name used on your website, which can be useful to indicate what theme has been chosen on your website. Here, I've got a button element with a click event, which uses the set theme action to either set the theme to light or default or dark. Using the formula editor, we can read the theme name that's been set and, for example, use an icon to represent the current theme using the show hide formula.